Sleet struck Patricia Ericsson's face in hard, slanting needles as she crossed the Whitby quay with a crate of wet laundry braced against her ribs, and by the time she reached the fish market her hem had turned black with harbour water and coal grit, clinging to her calves like cold hands. Dawn had not yet found warmth. It found only light, thin and grey, laid over nets, barrels, and the bent backs of women gutting cod on stained boards. Patricia's shoes took water at every step through the cracked seams near the toes. Her left thumb had split along an old lye burn and opened again under the crate's weight. Salt and soap stung the raw line of it until she felt each heartbeat there. She kept walking because stopping meant shifting the crate, and shifting the crate meant dropping it, and dropping Lady Harrowby's laundry would cost more than skin. A carter passed and looked once, then again, the way men looked when they recognised someone misplaced. She knew what they saw first: a servant girl in a mended dress with no gloves, and hair worked loose from its pins by wind. She knew what they said after she passed: the baronet's stepdaughter, the one upstairs, the one with no dowry left. One fishwife, broad-shouldered in a red shawl gone to rust at the edges, did not lower her voice at all. "Plain thing! Useless as damp wood, they say." Another answered while scraping scales into a bucket: "Lady Harrowby keeps her for labour, better than wages." The words landed like sleet, small, sharp, constant. Patricia shifted the crate higher, felt fabric grind over skin already rubbed raw at the collarbone, and fixed her eyes on the broken line of stone between warehouse and lane. She gave no answer. She had learned silence when she was 12, and her mother still lived, learned it again at 15, when silence became the only possession no one could seize and spend. Still, strangers watched her pass with a look she had stopped expecting and could not quite endure. Not pity exactly, but a kind of narrow attention, as if they could not make the house gossip agree with what stood before them. Dark hair whipped across her cheek. Her face, thinned by poor meals and long work, held angles that made her look severe at first glance. Then the eyes gave her away. Too large, too grave, not the eyes of a fool, not the eyes of a lazy girl. She crossed the square where gulls screamed over fish offal, and a boy laughed when a wheel splashed her skirt with brown water. She kept her expression still. The crate grew heavier with every yard uphill toward Harrowby House, and hunger sat under her ribs as a clean, hard pain that sharpened when she drew breath too deeply. By the church clock, it was not yet 7. She had been awake since before 4. Inside the service yard, the world narrowed to routine and command. The cook's maid took the crate without thanks because thanks had become a risk in that house. Kindness noticed by the wrong person cost places. Steam from the laundry room rolled into the passage and dampened the walls. Patricia's fingers were too stiff to untie the apron cord at her waist on the first try. She climbed the back stair to the attic beneath the eaves, each step crooked by age, each board cold through wet soles, and entered the small room that had once been used for broken trunks and now held the remainder of her life: a narrow truckle bed with one blanket, a wash basin with a crack like lightning through the glaze, a peg with 2 dresses both mended so often the original seams had gone, and a biscuit tin beneath the bed where she kept thread, 2 letters in her father's hand, and the account exercises he had taught her to copy in tight columns when she was little and still sat beside him at the dining table in daylight. The room smelled of damp plaster and old ash. Wind threaded through the loose frame of the single window and lifted the corner of the thin coverlet. She peeled off her stockings, wrung harbour water onto the floorboards, and held her hands over the candle stub without lighting it, as if warmth might be coaxed from memory alone. It did not come. Below, bells rang for breakfast in the family dining room. In the servants' hall, trenchers would be set now. In the attic there was only the heel of yesterday's bread wrapped in cloth, already hard. She broke it with effort and chewed until her jaw ached, swallowing with difficulty because hunger made the throat strange and narrow. Then she sat on the bed and inventoried, as she did each morning, what still required doing before noon: polish silver in the small parlour, mend the torn cuff on Miss Lydia's walking pelisse, carry coal to the schoolroom grate, copy Lady Harrowby's invitations in her neatest hand, because the lady liked a fine script and disliked paying a secretary. Her body protested each item in advance. Her knees ached from stairs. Her shoulders burned. Her hands shook once and stilled. By late afternoon, the house had turned bright above and dim below, as if the floors belonged to different worlds that never touched. Patricia moved between them with trays, with coal scuttles, with a basket of dry linens that smelled of starch and smoke. She kept to the side passages, where carpets thinned and wallpaper peeled, and when she crossed the main corridor by necessity, she kept her eyes lowered to avoid being accused of observing what was not hers to observe. At 6:30 she finished dusting the drawing-room cabinets, while Lady Harrowby dressed for dinner, silk whispering from behind a half-closed door, and the sweet, heavy scent of rose-water entering the corridor before its wearer appeared. Patricia stepped back with the feather brush in her hand. Lady Harrowby emerged in blue satin, pearls at her throat, face composed into that mild expression she wore for visitors and removed when doors shut. Her gaze dropped to Patricia's wet cuff, then to the reddened knuckles. "You have left streaks on the glass," she said. "I shall wipe them again, Lady Harrowby." "You shall do so after you stand outside the dining room until we finish. You were seen at market this morning speaking with fishwives. If my name is carried through gutters, you will go hungry for it." Patricia kept her eyes on the floor runner. "I did not speak." Lady Harrowby's smile sharpened by 1 degree. "Do not correct me. Earn your bread." She passed. The rustle of silk receded toward candlelight and silver. Patricia remained where she was until the footman glanced once toward her, then away at once, fear plain in the tightness of his mouth. She took her place in the corridor outside the dining-room doors before the first course was carried in. The dining-room doors stood open just enough to release warmth and the smell of roasted pheasant, buttered carrots, and wine. Patricia stood in the corridor beyond the spill of light with her hands folded against her apron, not from humility, but to stop the trembling. Inside, laughter rose and fell around the table where Lady Harrowby sat at the head, and her daughters leaned in bright gowns, bracelets chiming softly when they lifted their glasses. Patricia caught fragments as servants passed with dishes. "The plain one dropped half the wash, I am told. Father says she eats like a stable cat when watched. There may be a match in Leeds if terms are kind." The words moved through the doorway and settled on her skin. A maid from the kitchen came up the passage with a tureen, saw Patricia, and hesitated. Martha was older than most in the house, with hands swollen at the knuckles and eyes that missed little. "Miss Patricia," she whispered, without moving her lips, "there is broth left." Patricia gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not tonight. They will count the ladles." Martha's eyes filled, then cleared. She dipped her head and went in. No one else spoke to her. Candles burned lower, courses changed. Her stomach tightened and released in waves that made her light-headed. Once she put a hand to the wall to steady herself and felt the stone cold, even through plaster, solid as judgment. From somewhere below came the clatter of pans being stacked. From somewhere above came wind along the eaves. She stood through all of it, At last the family rose. Chairs scraped. Silk moved. Patricia stepped back into shadow as Lady Harrowby exited with her daughters, and did not glance in her direction, as if the corridor were empty and always had been. Only after the passage fell quiet did Patricia return to the drawing-room cabinet with her rag and vinegar water. She wiped each pane again by dwindling candlelight, working from top corner to base until the glass showed no streak at all, only her own blurred reflection moving with the flame. Near 10, when the house settled and doors latched, Patricia climbed again to the attic with no tray, no candle, no supper. Her legs felt carved hollow. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced shoes that had rubbed blisters open at both heels. She pressed a rag to one split finger until the throbbing slowed. Then she drew the biscuit tin from beneath the bed, opened it, and touched the top page of her father's old ledger exercises, the paper worn thin at the corners from handling, numbers in his hand, columns in hers beneath them, careful and straight, learned years ago at a table she no longer entered. Outside, sleet turned to rain and began tapping the window in a steady, patient rhythm. Patricia lay down without undressing, pulled the blanket to her chin and listened to her own breath drag in the dark, while hunger kept her awake long after the clocks had gone silent. Hunger would not let Patricia sleep, and rain on the attic glass counted out each empty minute with a patience that felt almost human. She turned on the narrow mattress, found no softer angle for her shoulders, and gave up the pretense of rest. The blanket slid from her knees as she sat, and cold moved over her at once, clean and immediate. She drew the biscuit tin onto her lap and lifted the lid with care, though no one waited at her door. Paper breathed out the faint smell of iron gall ink and old flour. On top lay the exercise sheet she had touched before lying down, columns of figures copied in her father's hand, and then in hers, his upright script steady as a mast, her smaller lines beneath trained toward the same precision. She placed her split finger beside one total and felt, absurdly, as if she were touching bone. He had taught her accounts at the long dining table downstairs when that room had still belonged to daylight and not performance. She could still hear him, broad palms spread over ledgers that smelled of sea salt and tar, speaking in measured English that carried a trace of the Baltic in its vowels. "Numbers are promises, Patricia. If a man alters them, he steals in silence." He had smiled then, not grandly, only with his eyes, and pushed the quill toward her. Again, no blot. A clear column is a clean conscience. In the final week, fever had burned him thin and bright in the chamber that now held Lady Harrowby's card guests. He had tried to rise even then when a clerk arrived, tried to dictate one more letter about freight insurance and harbour dues, and Patricia had knelt to hold the paper while his hand shook against the sheet. She remembered the heat of him through linen. She remembered her own voice, 15 and frightened and determined to sound calm. "Father, I can write it. Say the figures." He had looked at her as if seeing not a child but an heir. "You can write all of it," he had whispered. "Do not let them call you incapable." The memory did not soften with repetition. It pressed on her chest in the dark like a physical weight. She folded the exercise page back along its old crease and sat listening to the rain strike harder, to the house below breathing through beams and flues, while her own stomach clenched and released in hollow, stubborn waves. By the time the corridor clock struck 11, one dull bell climbing through plaster and timber to her room, Patricia had spread every paper on the coverlet and arranged them by date, as if order itself could keep the past from being stripped again. Beneath the account sheets lay a letter in her mother's hand. The ink faded to brown, edges softened from being read under poor light too many times. She held it near the window where rain-streaked moonlight gave just enough clarity to follow the familiar lines. Assurances, careful and overbrave, written the month before the remarriage. Her mother had been pretty in that tired way gentlewomen called resilience. She had pinned lace over worry and named it composure. At the chapel steps she had bent to Patricia's height and fastened a mantle at her throat with fingers that trembled only once. Sir Alister Harrowby, broad in the shoulders, pink from good port and indifferent weather, had waited by the carriage with a man accustomed to being obeyed by tenants and tradesmen alike. "It is security," her mother had said, voice low behind her smile. "It is a roof that will hold in winter. You shall still study. Nothing essential will change." Patricia had nodded because children nod when they are asked to bless what has already been decided. Nothing essential will change had lasted less than 2 years. After the wedding came entertainments, then obligations, then debts dressed as obligations, and after the debts came whispered conferences in rooms where she was told she had no business standing. Her mother began coughing in November, a small cough first, then one that bent her over the washstand until her knuckles went white. She died before spring had settled. Morning crepe hung from door knockers. The household wept in visible places and recalculated in private ones. Sir Alister followed her to the churchyard within a year, his heart failing at table between one course and the next. It had seemed indecent at the time that death could be so brisk in taking and so slow in releasing what it had disordered. Patricia folded the letter and pressed it to her mouth for one breath, then laid it flat again. Cold had reached her wrists. The candle stub remained unlit. She could not spare it. In the dark glass, the reflection of her face floated pale and narrow, hair loose at the temples, eyes too alert for midnight, as if sleep belonged to a different class of women. After Sir Alister's burial, Lady Harrowby had entered the house not as a mourner but as a claimant, silk-dry despite rain, lavender preceding her by a pace, keys at her waist before the week was out. She was Sir Alister's widowed sister by marriage, legal in her title to household management, and ruthless in the use of it. Patricia remembered the exact morning the terms shifted from discourtesy to structure. The library fire had burned low. Dust moved in the winter light. Lady Harrowby stood by her father's old escritoire and held out her hand without looking up from a stack of account books. "You will give me all keys now. You are no longer mistress's daughter. You are a dependent." Patricia had placed the ring of keys on the desk one by one, hearing each iron tooth strike wood like a nail. "My father's trust papers are in that drawer," she had said, keeping her voice formal because anger would have been used as proof of insolence. Lady Harrowby had lifted one brow and shut the drawer with 2 fingers. "Your father had creditors and optimism in equal quantity. I have no use for either." By Lent, the schoolroom mistress was dismissed. By Easter, Patricia's room was moved from the 2nd floor to the attic under pretence of repairs that never began. Her books thinned. First the French grammar disappeared, then the atlas, then the volume of shipping law her father had annotated in the margins. Miss Lydia took her blue wool cloak and called it borrowing. Miss Clara wore Patricia's mother's amber comb to a musicale and returned it with 2 teeth broken. At dinner, Lady Harrowby would speak of her across the cloth as if she were absent even when she stood with the sideboard tray in her hands. "She has a plain face and no fortune. She must be useful where she can." When tradesmen asked why the baronet's stepdaughter carried coal scuttles, Lady Harrowby answered in sweet tones that idleness had spoiled the girl, and labour was a corrective. More than once Patricia caught the lady in the old study turning out drawers, lifting floor runners, checking behind account folios with a quick, practised impatience. The first time had been enough. Patricia moved what mattered that same night. She wrapped her father's codicil, 2 trust receipts, and 1 letter naming executor obligations in oiled cloth, and hid them where no one of rank would think to look, in a flour tin behind cracked preserving jars in the still room, until she could bring them to the attic a page at a time. The papers in her tin now were thin and real and dangerous. They proved figures had been altered. They proved income from the Ericsson shipping shares had not vanished but been diverted into gaming notes, silk invoices, and debts concealed as household necessity. They also proved, with legal indifference, that truth alone could not force power to release its grip without witness. A laugh rose from below and broke against her floorboards, followed by the dull clink of glasses from the morning room, where Lady Harrowby liked to play cards after midnight with neighbours too indebted to refuse and too proud to leave early. Patricia stilled and listened despite herself. Voices travelled up the service flue in pieces, distorted by brick, but Lady Harrowby's cadence carried even when words blurred. "Before winter ends," she was saying, each syllable crisp, "I shall have her settled. Mr. Fenwick in Leeds has means and a need for orderly management. He asks little in beauty. He asks obedience." Another woman murmured something Patricia could not catch. Lydia's sharper tone followed. "She will cry and pretend gratitude." Clara laughed, soft and careless. "She may at least remove that solemn face from our halls." Heat went through Patricia then. Not from comfort, but from the old, clean burn of being priced in conversation, as if she were furniture worn at the edges but still marketable. She placed one hand over the papers to keep it from shaking, and waited until the voices dipped again into cards and gossip and the scrape of chair legs. No one came upstairs. No one ever did, unless sent. She refolded each document with exact corners, slid them into oiled cloth, and returned the bundle to the biscuit tin beneath thread and darning needles. Then she crossed to the loose board under the bed and eased it up with the blade of her small sewing scissors, knuckles whitening as wood resisted and yielded. The tin settled into the cavity with a soft metal knock. She lowered the board, pressed it flat with both palms, sat back on her heels until breath steadied. Rain continued at the window, no longer sleet, only rain now, relentless and ordinary over slate and stone and chimneys that vented warmth she did not share. Patricia rose, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a mantle too thin for weather, and stood in the centre of the room as if taking measure of a territory no one else would defend for her. She had no supper, no ally with power, and no certainty beyond the papers hidden under rough plank. She had her name. She had her father's hand on paper teaching her to read theft in a column of numbers. She had the stubborn knowledge that endurance was not surrender unless she allowed others to define it. When she finally lay down again, she placed one raw hand over the place in the floor where the tin lay concealed, and kept it there until the chill numbed her fingers and the night thinned inch by inch toward morning. When the first cartwheels began to grind over the stones beyond Harrowby House, Patricia was still awake, her palm flat on the loose board beneath the bed, as if she could hold the hidden tin in place by force of skin and bone alone. The room had gone from black to iron grey. Rain had thinned to a fine hiss against the pane. Her fingers had numbed where they touched the plank. She rose when the kitchen bell rang below, washed in water that bit like metal, and pinned her hair with hands that would not quite steady. She had not slept. Sleep was a luxury that required safety, and safety had become a rumour in that house. By noon, the rain returned in hard sheets that blurred the courtyard and drove the chickens under the cart shed. Patricia moved from pantry to schoolroom to backstair with wet hems and aching knees, carrying trays she was not permitted to eat from, and coal she was not permitted to warm herself beside. The house smelled of damp wool, tallow and lavender powder from the upstairs chambers. Her stomach had settled into a cold hollow that no longer cramped. It simply stayed there, a fact like weather. Near 4, while she was mending a torn cuff in the passage outside Lady Harrowby's dressing room, the door opened without warning, and silk brushed the jamb. Lady Harrowby held out a sealed note between 2 fingers. Red wax. Harrowby crest pressed deep. You will take this to the Black Gull Coaching Inn. Patricia looked up. Rain struck the corridor window in a constant rattle. Now, Lady Harrowby. Now. The lane is flooding at the lower turn. Lady Harrowby's mouth curved, not kindly. Then step high. Give this only to Mr. Bellamy, the posting master. You will wait for a receipt. You will not speak to guests. You will return directly. If you fail, you will not require supper tomorrow either. Patricia took the letter. The wax was still faintly warm. Yes, Lady Harrowby. And Miss Patricia. She paused. If anyone asks why you are abroad at this hour, you will always say you go on household business because your betters have trusted you with it. You will say it with gratitude. Patricia lowered her eyes because her voice might betray her if she did not. As you command. No cloak was offered. She took the thinnest mantle from the peg in the scullery, tied it at her throat, and stepped into the yard where rain struck her face so sharply it felt like thrown gravel. Mud swallowed her shoes to the ankle at the gate. She tucked the sealed note under her bodice to keep the wax from washing soft, and set out along the lane toward town, head down against wind carrying salt from the harbour, and peat smoke from 100 chimneys. By the first week of November, darkness came before honest evening, and the road to the Black Gull turned treacherous before the church clock struck 5. Patricia walked the hedge line where stones gave better footing than ruts. Twice carts passed with lamps swinging, and drivers did not slow. Dirty water leapt from wheels and soaked her skirts to the thigh. At the bend above the old malt house she slipped, caught herself on one hand, and rose with grit embedded in her palm. She kept going. Every errand in that house carried the same command under it. Return quickly, return silent, return useful. The Black Gull's lantern appeared through rain as a dull amber smear. Stable boys shouted under the eaves. Horses stamped and blew steam into the cold. Patricia crossed the yard and entered the posting room, where wet wool and ale and saddle soap hung thick in the air. Mr. Bellamy stood behind the counter with quill in hand, spectacles low on his nose. Lady Harrowby's note, Patricia said, drawing it out carefully. He took it, glanced at the seal, and nodded once. Wait there. I shall mark receipt. She stood near the door as ordered, water dripping from her mantle onto the rush mat. Men at the fire glanced over and away. One traveller whispered to another. She did not catch the words, but she knew the look. Curiosity sharpened by class, the quick measure of a woman damp and plain in mended cloth, who held herself too straight for a scullery maid and too worn for a gentlewoman. Mr. Bellamy scratched his initials onto a folded chit and handed it across. Take care on the lane, he said quietly. Eyes on the counter, not on her. The bridge stones are slick. Thank you. She tucked the receipt into her sleeve and stepped back into the storm. The yard had grown louder. Another coach had just come in. 6 horses lathered, harness chains clattering. A groom ran past her toward the far gate. Somewhere beyond the stable wall, iron struck stone with a sound like a bell cracked in half. Then came the horse's scream. It tore through rain and human noise together, high and raw and wrong. Patricia spun toward the lane. A carriage lantern pitched sideways in the dark beyond the inn gate. Wood splintered. Men shouted over one another, "Hold him! Back, back! He's coming over!" The axle! God preserve us! The axle is gone! She was already running before thought formed. Mud yanked at her shoes. Rain blinded her for 2 strides, 4. She reached the ditch where the lane sloped and saw the coach canted hard against the embankment, one wheel broken clean, the body tilted like a ship taking water. One horse thrashed in harness, whites of its eyes flashing in the lamp glow. A footman clung to the bridle and swore through clenched teeth. The coachman had fallen, one arm cradled against his chest, shouting orders nobody obeyed in the same way. A child cried from inside the tilted cab. Patricia dropped to her knees in mud and gripped the carriage door handle. It jammed against the slope. She braced one shoulder, shoved and felt it give an inch, then 2, rainwater and broken glass spilling out. The crying sharpened. "It is stuck!" a man yelled behind her. "Leave it to us!" She planted both feet and pulled again until the door lurched wide enough for a slim body to pass. Inside, a boy of perhaps 9 clung to the opposite seat, face white under wet curls, one sleeve dark with mud where he had struck the frame. Patricia reached in. "Come to me!" He stared without moving, shaking hard. "Come now!" The carriage shifted with a groan. She did not wait for his courage. She climbed halfway in, caught him under the arms, and drew him across splintered wood and rain-slick leather into her lap. He cried out when his left arm knocked the door frame. "Easy," she said, breathless. "I have you. Easy." Boots pounded through the mud behind her. "Stand back from the wheel." The voice hit like a command fired on parade ground deep, clipped, used to instant obedience. Patricia turned, still kneeling. The child pressed against her and saw a rider dismount in one fluid motion at the edge of the lantern light. Tall, broad through shoulder and chest, even under rain-dark greatcoat. Dark hair plastered at the temples, jaw cut hard as quarried stone. He stripped one glove with his teeth and threw the reins at a groom without looking. "Thomas," he said, already moving, eyes on the boy in her arms. The child gave a ragged sob. "Uncle!" Patricia knew the man before anyone named him. Everyone in Whitby knew the shape of Lord Ashcombe by rumour, if not sight. The northern estate, the war scar, the brother dead in a hunting fall, the temper that could freeze a room. He reached them in 3 strides, rain running from his coat hem in black lines. Up close his face was paler than she expected, carved and still, his eyes the colour of deep water before a storm. "Give him here!" Patricia tightened her hold by instinct as the boy whimpered and tried to burrow against her shoulder. "His arm is hurt." "I said, give him here!" The words would have cowed most men in the yard. She looked at the boy's sleeve, at the angle where forearm met elbow, and shook her head once. "If he is lifted wrongly, it will worsen." For 1 second the lane held its breath. Rain hammered wood and harness and hats. A groom near the ditch stared as if waiting for thunder. Lord Ashcombe's gaze dropped to her hands around his nephew. Mud to the wrist. Knuckles split and reddened, fingers trembling despite the firmness of her grip. Then his eyes moved lower, to her soaked skirt, to the cracked leather at the toes of her shoes where water pushed through with each shift of weight. "Who are you," he said, "to issue instruction in my lane?" "Patricia Erickson." Recognition flickered, slight and hard. "Harrowby's stepdaughter." "Yes, my lord." His mouth did not soften. "You are out alone." "On errand." Another groan came from the broken coach as the trapped wheel settled deeper. Thomas flinched and buried his face in her mantle. Patricia shifted, trying to shield him from flying mud as men cut harness straps. Lord Ashcombe crouched at their level. Rain ran down his cheek and along the line of an old pale scar, crossing his wrist where his glove had torn. Blood had soaked the cuff beneath, thin but steady. "Thomas!" His voice changed by 1 degree quieter, no less firm. "Look at me." The boy looked up, eyes huge. "Can you move your fingers?" Thomas lifted his hand. 2 fingers twitched, then all 5. "Good." Ashcombe's jaw set. He looked at Patricia again. "Set him down on the bank." "There is standing water there." "Set him down." She rose anyway, cradling the child and moving to the least flooded patch near the hedge. Lord Ashcombe followed, then halted when Thomas gave a sharp cry at the jolt. Patricia knelt and drew the boy against her knees, one hand at his shoulder, one supporting the injured arm without pulling. "Do not touch the forearm," she said to no one and everyone. Ashcombe looked at her as if the rain itself had spoken. "My lord," she added through her teeth, "with respect." His nostrils flared once. "Bellamy, lantern here." Mr. Bellamy hurried forward, lifting the light. In the stronger glow, Patricia saw the swelling beginning under Thomas's cuff, already tightening the cloth. She slid her fingers to the seam and tore the wet sleeve upward in one clean rip. The boy hissed in pain. She bent close. "Listen to me, Thomas. You must be very brave for 6 breaths. Count them." He nodded against her shoulder, shuddering. Lord Ashcombe's hand came down on her wrist, iron hard. "What are you doing?" Seeing where it is displaced. "Leave him. My surgeon is 10 minutes behind." 10 minutes is long in cold rain. His grip tightened, then stopped when he felt her shaking. Not fear alone, cold, exhaustion, hunger drilling through adrenaline. She met his gaze without lowering hers, though her teeth had begun to strike together. "I have set dock fractures before," she said. "My father taught me when men came in crushed by cargo. If I hold him still and bind above and below, he may travel without further injury." The yard noises receded beneath rain and the boy's ragged breathing. Ashcombe released her wrist slowly. He stripped off his second glove and held it in one hand, as if deciding whether to command or concede. "Do it," he said at last. "Now." Patricia did not waste the permission. She tore a long strip from her own undersleeve, then another, fingers clumsy in wet cold. Mr. Bellamy passed a short splint cut from broken carriage trim. She set it beside the arm and spoke to Thomas all the while, counting breaths with him, steady and low. At the 3rd breath she pressed at the elbow with practised precision. The boy cried out once, then sagged with a startled gasp. "There," she whispered. "There, it is done." She wrapped the strips tight enough to hold, loose enough to spare circulation, knotting with numb fingers that barely obeyed her. By the 6th breath, Thomas had gone from crying to hard, hiccuping silence, forehead against her shoulder. Ashcombe had not moved. Rain streamed from his hair and collar. His wounded hand hung at his side, blood diluted pink by water, unnoticed by everyone but her. She looked up. "He must be kept warm." A muscle jumped once in his jaw. "You are shaking." "It can wait." "Your hands are raw. You are shaking. You came in shoes with holes." The words struck harder than any insult in Lady Harrowby's halls, because they named what others stepped around. Patricia swallowed and looked back to Thomas. "My lord," Mr. Bellamy said carefully, "the carriage cannot be righted tonight. We can stable the team and fetch another coach from town." Ashcombe nodded without taking his eyes from Patricia. "Do it." He reached for Thomas then, slower this time. The boy clung to Patricia's mantle for one stubborn second before allowing himself to be lifted. Ashcombe took his weight with controlled care, one arm under knees, the other bracing his back, and turned toward the inn. Patricia rose too quickly. The lane tilted. Darkness crowded the edges of her vision, a narrowing ring. She put one hand to the coach wheel to steady herself and felt splintered wood-bite skin. Ashcombe stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Do not move. I must return to Harrowby House. In this weather, I was ordered." His expression hardened into something colder than anger. "Order does not alter physics, Miss Erikson. You can scarcely stand." "I shall walk. You shall not." Rain beat against them both. Stable boys ran past carrying tack. Someone led the injured horse away, head low, flanks quivering. Thomas, half conscious against his uncle's coat, whispered Patricia's name as if afraid she might vanish. Ashcombe shifted the child higher and gave his next words with the same authority he had used on the lane, yet the force of it covered rather than crushed. "You will ride in my carriage, Miss Erikson, and you will not return on foot." Patricia drew one breath that burned in her throat and steadied herself against the broken wheel. "My lord, if I am seen arriving at Harrowby House from your carriage at night, Lady Harrowby will call it proof of misconduct." "Lady Harrowby may call rain dry if it pleases her." His gaze did not shift. "You are not walking 2 miles through floodwater in those shoes." Thomas stirred against his uncle's shoulder and gave a weak, frightened sound. Patricia looked at the boy, then back to Ashcombe's bleeding wrist, then to the lane where water already ran in narrow streams over stone. "I will ride," she said at last, "on one condition." His brow lifted a fraction. Rain tracked down the hard line of his cheek. "The splint must be checked within the quarter hour," she said. "If swelling increases, the binding must be eased. If his fingers pale, the knot must be cut and reset. I will not leave until that is done." For a moment she expected rebuke. She expected rank, distance, dismissal. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "Done." He turned toward the inn-yard and barked orders in clipped sequence. "Bellamy, clear the blue post chaise. Dry blankets, hot bricks wrapped in wool. Send for Mr. Hales now. Tell him a child's arm has been set and must be examined." Men moved at once. The stable-yard, which had been confusion a moment before, found a single rhythm under his voice. Patricia stood where she was until her legs stopped threatening to buckle, then followed through mud that sucked at her soles, and tried to hold her back. Inside the Black Gull's side passage, heat from the kitchen range hit her wet skin and hurt more than cold had. Her split fingers flared with sharp pain. Water ran from her mantle hem and pooled on worn flagstones. A maid stared at her torn sleeve and mud-caked skirt, then at the child in Lord Ashcombe's arms, and stepped back so quickly she struck the wall. Ashcombe carried Thomas into a small private parlour off the posting room. The chamber held a narrow fire, 2 horsehair chairs, 1 worn sofa, and a table scarred by years of tankards. Patricia stopped just inside the threshold, uncertain where she was permitted to stand. "Shut the door," Ashcombe said to the footman behind him. "No one enters unless I call." The latch fell. Thomas whimpered as his uncle lowered him onto the sofa. Patricia moved without asking. She knelt beside the boy, tested his fingertips for warmth, then touched the cloth binding where water had begun to soak through. "Thomas," she said softly, "can you squeeze my hand?" He did, weakly. "Good." Again. He obeyed. His eyes were glassy with shock, but he followed instruction. She loosened the outer wrap 1 turn and watched colour return more evenly to his nails. Ashcombe stood at the foot of the sofa, rainwater still dripping from his greatcoat to the rush mat, one gloved hand bare and blood-streaked. He had gone very still. Only his chest moved, controlled and shallow. "You should sit, my lord," Patricia said, eyes still on Thomas's hand. "I am standing. Your wrist is bleeding." "It is trivial." She looked up then, unable to keep silence any longer. "A wound does not become clean because a title says so." His mouth thinned. Not anger exactly. Resistance. Thomas opened his eyes wider and tried to turn toward his uncle, then hissed in pain. Patricia slid one hand behind his shoulders and kept him from twisting. "Do not move that side," she murmured. "You are safe. You are inside. Breathe slowly." By the time the church clock in the square struck 6, each bell muffled by rain and distance, the room had taken on a strained, watchful quiet. Stable noise rose and fell outside the shuttered window. Boots passed in the corridor. The fire snapped once as a damp knot in the wood gave way. Ashcombe had removed his coat but not sat down. His shirt cuff at the right wrist was dark with blood where torn leather had cut him. He ignored it with the discipline of a man trained to discount pain until it became dangerous. Patricia saw the old scar crossing the same wrist, pale and ridged in the firelight, pulling slightly whenever his hand flexed. A knock came. "My lord," said Mr. Bellamy through the door, "Mr. Hales is here. Enter." The surgeon was a narrow man in his 50s, with ink stains on 2 fingers and rain on his collar. He took in the room in one sweep. The child on the sofa, Ashcombe standing rigid, Patricia kneeling in mud-stiff skirts with her sleeve torn away to the elbow. "Who set the arm?" he asked, already opening his case. "I did," Patricia said. Mr. Hales looked at her properly then, surprise clear before professional habit covered it. "Name?" "Patricia Erickson." He gave a short nod and moved to Thomas's side. "Tell me precisely what you observed." She answered in sequence. Mechanism of injury, visible displacement, initial circulation, time elapsed before reduction, angle of pressure, amount of resistance, child's response after alignment. The surgeon listened without interruption, fingers probing carefully along the splintered forearm while Thomas gritted his teeth. At last he sat back on his heels. "It is well done," he said, "very well done. I shall reinforce it and keep your placement." Thomas's breath shuddered out. Patricia felt her own shoulders drop by 1 degree, tension easing only when someone else bore responsibility. Mr. Hales re-wrapped the splint with dry linen and secured it with practised turns. Patricia held the lamp steady for him, because her hands, despite trembling, were steadier than the footman's. When the final knot was tied, the surgeon checked the boy's pulse, then looked to Ashcombe. "He must be kept warm and still tonight. No riding until morning, and then only in a sprung carriage at walking pace. If fever rises, send immediately." Ashcombe inclined his head once. "You will stay at the hall?" "If required." "Required." Mr. Hales began to pack his instruments, then paused and glanced at Patricia's hands. "Miss Erickson, those splits on your fingers should be salved. Lie burns left open in this weather invite infection." "I understand, sir." He hesitated as if to add something else, then thought better of it, and bowed himself out. When the door shut, Thomas reached for Patricia's skirt with his uninjured hand. "Do not go," he whispered, voice hoarse. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She smoothed wet curls back from his forehead. "I must return to my house." He looked at Ashcombe, panic rising. "Uncle, tell her!" Ashcombe's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened as it moved from Thomas's hand clutching Patricia's skirt to Patricia's face. "Stay until he sleeps," he said. It was a command. It was also a request he would not phrase as one. Patricia recognised the difference and did not let it show. "I can stay for a short while." Ashcombe stepped to the table, poured water into a cup, and held it out. "Drink." "I am not..." "Drink." She took it because refusal would waste strength she no longer had. The water tasted faintly of tin. Her hands shook against the cup rim hard enough to click porcelain once. She set it down quickly and folded her fingers together to still them. Thomas drifted in and out for the next quarter hour, pain and exhaustion pulling at him in turns. Patricia sat on the rug beside the sofa and spoke to him in low, even tones, counting breaths as she had in the lane, then naming ordinary things to anchor him. The sound of rain on shutters, the heat from the hearth, the rough weave of the blanket over his knees. At one point, when another gust rattled the window hard and he startled awake, she began to recite multiplication tables under her breath, the same cadence her father once used at the dining table. Thomas listened, confused at first, then calmer, as if the measured numbers made a kind of wall between him and fear. She did not know Ashcombe had moved to the far side of the room until she looked up and found him watching her from the shadow near the mantel, his wounded hand wrapped now in a strip of clean linen someone else had tied. He had done it silently. He had watched silently. There was no mockery in his face, no soft praise either, only attention, unblinking and exact. A second knock broke the stillness. "My lord!" came a woman's voice from the passage, tight with worry. "It is Mrs. Ellery. I beg you, may I see Master Thomas?" Ashcombe crossed and opened the door a hand's breadth. Mrs. Ellery, Thomas's governess, stood in a drenched cloak with her bonnet askew, eyes red-rimmed from fear. Behind her hovered one of Ashcombe's grooms, mud to the knee. "He is alive," Ashcombe said before she could speak. "His arm is set. You may come in quietly." She entered, saw the splint, and covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears spilled at once. "Oh, my dear boy!" Thomas blinked up at her and managed, "Do not cry, Mrs. Ellery. Miss Erickson fixed it." Mrs. Ellery looked toward Patricia then, startled by the credit. Her gaze took in the torn sleeve, soaked dress, and raw hands. "You brought him out?" Patricia rose from the rug, knees protesting. "The door jammed." "It opened enough." Mrs. Ellery turned to Ashcombe as if for confirmation. He gave a short nod. "She pulled him clear and set the fracture before Hales arrived." The governess's expression shifted from shock to gratitude so fierce it seemed to pain her. She reached for Patricia's hand, then stopped when she saw the split skin and simply bowed her head instead. "I will remember this all my life, Miss Erickson." Patricia did not know where to place such words. She gave the smallest inclination in return. From the corridor came raised male voices, then the quick approach of boots. The groom at the door stiffened. "My lord," he said, "the magistrate's man is here taking statements on the road accident. He asks whether to question the coachman now." Ashcombe's face hardened. "Not tonight. Dawes has a broken clavicle and half a concussion. He answers when he can stand upright without vomiting." The groom shifted. "Sir, the constable says there are rumours in the yard that Dawes drove reckless down the hill." Patricia spoke before caution could stop her. "He did not." Every head in the room turned. She swallowed once and continued, voice formal, though her pulse jumped. "The left rear axle pin was cracked before the turn. I saw the break, clean fatigue line at the inner edge, not fresh impact alone. When the wheel struck the rut, it sheared. The coachman hauled the lead pair to avoid overturning fully into the ditch. If he had not, we would be carrying a body, not an injured child." The groom stared, uncertain whether to believe a mud-soaked woman over stable talk. Ashcombe held his gaze. "You heard Miss Erickson?" "Yes, my lord." "Repeat her statement to the constable exactly. Then tell him I will give formal account at 8 tomorrow." The groom bowed and withdrew. Mrs. Ellery looked from one to the other, astonishment plain. "You know carriage mechanics, Miss Erickson?" "My father traded shipping and wagons alike," Patricia said. "Cargo teaches consequence quickly." Ashcombe said nothing, yet the room seemed to tighten around his silence, as if each omission carried weight. Thomas's eyes had gone heavy at last. Mrs. Ellery sat beside him and began to hum under her breath, one hand resting lightly over the blanket. Patricia stepped back to give space. Her wet skirt clung and chilled. Fatigue came down on her all at once, heavy as sodden wool. Ashcombe noticed immediately. "You can scarcely remain standing. I have stood through worse. Not tonight." He moved to the chair nearest the fire and pulled it out with one hand, a gesture almost abrupt in its directness. "Sit." She hesitated. "Sit, Miss Erikson." She obeyed because her knees would betray her if she did not. Heat from the hearth reached her shins and made them ache. She held her hands toward the flames, palms down so the cracked skin would not split further. Ashcombe stood over the table for a moment as if considering terms in a negotiation only he could see. Then he spoke without preamble. "Lady Harrowby sent you here in this weather with no escort." "Yes." "With shoes unfit for dry weather, let alone flood." Patricia kept her eyes on the fire. "Yes." "She keeps you hungry." The words were flat, not a question. Patricia's throat closed. She chose care over denial. "My household arrangements are not for public discussion, my lord." "Liar!" The word came low and precise, not shouted, more cutting for its control. He stepped closer, enough that she could see rain still caught in the dark threads of his hair, enough that she could smell wet wool and iron from old blood beneath clean linen. His voice did not rise. "You are exhausted to collapse. Your hands are flayed from lie. You had no cloak worth naming in a sleet storm. You argued medical procedure while shaking from cold because you knew the child's arm mattered more than your own safety. Do not ask me to pretend I did not witness what I witnessed." Silence followed, broken only by the fire and Thomas's uneven breathing. Patricia felt heat climb her face, not from attraction, not from comfort, but from the violence of being seen accurately after years of studied invisibility. She answered the only part she could answer. "He was in pain." "Yes." "He needed someone to act quickly." "Yes. You would have done the same." Ashcombe's jaw tightened. "I was 6 horse lengths away." "And I was not." The corners of his mouth shifted then, barely. Not quite a smile, more like restraint changing shape. He looked toward the sofa where Thomas slept at last, lashes dark against too pale skin, then back to Patricia. "You defended Dawes without being asked," he said. "Why?" "Because truth does not improve by waiting for permission." He held her gaze for a long moment, unreadable, then gave one short nod as if a private calculation had resolved. Outside, rain beat on, steady and severe. Inside, the boys slept. Mrs. Ellery kept watch. The fire settled to a lower burn. Patricia rose from the chair, every muscle protesting. "He is sleeping. I should go." Ashcombe's answer came at once. "You will not walk." "Then I will take a hired trap." "At this hour? In this weather?" "No." She lifted her chin, too tired to disguise her stubbornness. "My lord, you command your own household. You do not command mine." His eyes darkened, winter deep. "I command what concerns my nephew's safety and the welfare of any witness under my protection while this road remains hazardous. That includes you tonight." Mrs. Ellery looked up sharply at the last words, but said nothing. Patricia knew the risk of accepting. She knew the greater risk of refusing and collapsing in a ditch before she reached home. Pride could not warm bone. Pride could not mend torn skin. "What do you propose?" Ashcombe did not hesitate. "Thomas does not travel tonight. Mr. Hales forbade it. He remains here, warm and still, with Mrs. Ellery beside him. Bellamy will clear rooms at once, and I will have Hales called again if fever rises. At first light, if Hales allows it, Thomas goes by sprung carriage to Ashcombe Hall at walking pace. You will go now in my closed-post chaise to Harrowby House with my groom and Bellamy's boy to witness your safe arrival. If Lady Harrowby bars your entry, they return you here, and Bellamy gives you a room on my account. In either case, you will not set foot on that road alone tonight." The plan was blunt, practical, and impossible to mistake as gallantry. It was logistics shaped like care. Patricia looked at Thomas, at the small hand curled over blanket edge, at the firm line of Ashcombe's injured wrist where fresh linen had already begun to spot through. She nodded once. "Very well." Ashcombe turned to the door and called for the carriage with the same clipped authority as before. Men answered from the passage. Wheels rolled in the yard. Harness chains rang. When he faced her again, his voice dropped, almost quiet. "You did precisely right in that lane, Miss Erickson." She had no reply equal to the weight of it. She gathered her torn mantle, checked Thomas's splint one final time, and stepped toward the door as the rain hammered the shutters and the night divided into separate watches. She had reached the threshold when his voice stopped her again. "Wait!" Patricia turned. Ashcombe had already taken up the heavy greatcoat he had shed in the parlour. Rain had darkened the wool to near black. He held it out once. "Put this on." She looked from the coat to his face. "My lord, I cannot arrive in your coat." "You can arrive warm." "It will be remarked upon." "It is already remarked upon that you were in a road wreck and set my nephew's arm." He stepped closer by one pace. "I will not have you take fever to spare gossip." She should have refused again. She knew she should, yet her teeth had begun to strike together, and the fire's brief comfort had already left her bones. She put her arms into sleeves far too long for her, and felt trapped heat close around her, rain and horse and clean linen still in the cloth. Ashcombe drew the front together at her throat with a single efficient movement, not touching skin, only fabric. "There," he said. The word landed like an order and something gentler hidden inside it. They moved into the passage. Mrs. Ellery remained by Thomas, humming low. Mr. Bellamy stood ready with a lantern and a folded blanket. The groom Ashcombe had named Reeve waited at the outer door with hat brim dripping and mud to his boots. "Post-chaise is at the side step, my lord," Reeve said. "Good. You ride the box. Bellamy's boy rides behind. You do not leave Miss Erickson until she is inside Harrowby House and the door is shut." "Yes, my lord." Patricia drew breath to protest the ceremony of it, but Ashcombe spoke over the attempt. "You have your receipt from Bellamy." She blinked, surprised by the detail. "Yes, in my sleeve." "Keep it. If anyone claims you wandered, you place the time in their hands." He had thought 3 moves ahead already. She felt a strange, unsteady pressure behind her ribs, not fear alone. To be planned for was an unfamiliar condition. Rain struck hard the moment the door opened. The inn-yard shone in broken pools under swinging lamps. Men crossed with lowered heads and hunched shoulders. Harness metal flashed and vanished. Ashcombe took the lantern from Bellamy himself and walked beside Patricia through the mud as if the rank between them had been cancelled by weather. She nearly slipped at the chaise step when her wet shoe skidded on iron. His hand closed around her elbow, firm as a clamp, and held until her footing settled. "Slowly," he said. She climbed in. Reeve passed the blanket after her. Bellamy's boy shut the carriage door. Through rain-smeared glass, Patricia saw Ashcombe hand the lantern back and speak to Reeve once more, face hard in profile, scar pale at his wrist where linen showed beneath his cuff. Then the chaise lurched forward. The interior smelled of damp leather and hot brick. Someone had wrapped the brick in flannel and tucked it by the floorboard. Patricia set her feet near it and felt pain wake in her toes as numbness retreated. She clenched the blanket around her shoulders and tried to quiet the shaking that had nothing to do with cold now that she was enclosed and moving. Outside, wheels hissed through standing water. Hooves struck stone where the lane rose. The carriage swayed and settled, each motion tugging at her bruised shoulders. She could not stop seeing Thomas's white face in the tilted cab. She could not stop hearing Lady Harrowby's voice, precise and sweet, if she arrived late, if she arrived escorted, if she arrived alive by the wrong route. At the lower bridge, the chaise slowed to a crawl. Water ran over the stones in silver sheets. Reeve called to the horses. They found footing and climbed. Patricia pressed one hand against the carriage wall and found her fingers leaving small crescents of mud on polished wood. She wiped them at once on the torn edge of her skirt, then remembered she wore Ashcombe's coat over it and stilled, guilty for soiling what she had not earned. By the second quarter hour after leaving the Black Gull, the lamps of Harrowby House showed through rain as blurred yellow wounds in the dark. The front gates were shut. Reeve leaned down and struck the bell chain with his whip butt. No answer. He struck again. Patricia's stomach tightened. Lady Harrowby had a habit of delaying entry to teach obedience by wet and cold. She would do it with greater pleasure if she knew whose carriage stood at her drive. Reeve swore softly under his breath. "Gatekeeper has gone deaf tonight." Then another shape emerged from the rain to the side of the chaise, tall and unhurried. Patricia started before she recognised him. Ashcombe had ridden behind on horseback, coatless now, rain running down his shoulders and hat brim in relentless lines. He had not left, after all. He did not look toward the carriage at first. He looked at the shut gate. "Open!" he called. The single word carried through storm and timber both. A lantern jerked to life in the gatehouse. Bolts scraped. The gate opened with visible reluctance. Reeve drove through. Gravel spat under wheels. At the front portico, 2 footmen in Harrowby livery came out with cloaks over their heads, and confusion plain in every movement. One recognised the crest on the chaise door, and went pale. Patricia reached for the handle. Ashcombe was already there, one boot on the carriage step, hand offered without flourish. She took it and descended. The front door opened wider. Lady Harrowby herself stood framed in candlelight, silk wrapper belted over evening gown, lavender scent drifting even through wet air. Surprise flashed across her face and was replaced at once by cultivated concern. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, voice warm enough to pass in any drawing-room. "What distressing weather! To what do we owe—" "Your stepdaughter was on your business when the axle failed at the Black Gull Lane." He did not bow. Rain streamed from his hair to his collar. "My nephew was injured." She extracted him and set his arm before the surgeon arrived. Lady Harrowby turned to Patricia, as if seeing her for the first time. "Patricia, child, why are you standing in the rain? Come in at once." The false tenderness was so smooth it almost worked. Almost. Patricia moved toward the threshold. Lady Harrowby's gaze dropped to the greatcoat around her shoulders and sharpened by 1 cold degree. Her smile did not break, but the hand at her side tightened on the wrapper cord. "How thoughtful," she said lightly. "You have borrowed his lordship's coat." Ashcombe answered before Patricia could shape a safe reply. "I ordered it." She was shivering. Lady Harrowby inclined her head. "Naturally. She is dramatic in weather." "Is she?" He said it without volume. The footman went still. Ashcombe stepped into the spill of light, not entering the house, only standing where everyone could see him clearly. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto Harrowby's polished stone. His face had gone carved and blank in the way men look before issuing sentence. Miss Erickson had split hands, soaked shoes, and no proper cloak when she reached the inn, he said. She had enough knowledge to reduce a fracture under pressure while grown men shouted and failed to decide. She then gave an accurate mechanical account to my groom that likely clears your coachman of false blame. If this is your definition of dramatic, I suggest you retain more dramatic people." Lady Harrowby's eyes widened in practised offence. "My lord, I assure you Patricia is cared for according to her station." Patricia felt the old instinct rise to placate, to soften, to reduce herself before damage spread. She opened her mouth. Ashcombe spoke first. "No." The word cut across hers and Lady Harrowby's both. He turned his head slightly toward Patricia without taking his eyes from Lady Harrowby. "You will stand quiet a moment." It should have felt like domination. It felt like a wall thrown up between her and a blow she had seen coming since the gate. Lady Harrowby gave a strained laugh. "Surely we need not discuss household discipline in the rain." "We are discussing evidence, Lady Harrowby." His gaze shifted once, brief and exact, taking in Patricia's reddened knuckles where the cuff had ridden back, the mud line at her hem, the tremor she could no longer conceal. "I have seen her at dawn on the quay this fortnight," he said. "Twice with laundry loads fit for 2 men. Once carrying coal scuttles through sleet while your daughters took the air under fur. Do not insult both of us with fiction." Patricia stared at him. Rain beat on the portico roof. She had not known he had ever been close enough to witness those mornings. She had thought those hours belonged to anonymity and fishwives and gulls. Lady Harrowby's composure faltered, recovered. "If your lordship has observed my household, perhaps your lordship has observed that dependent girls must learn usefulness." "She has learned it. That lesson is complete." Silence spread, taut and thin. One footman looked at the floor. The other looked at Patricia and then away, shame in the movement. Ashcombe reached to his own wrist and pulled loose the signet ring from his right hand, heavy gold bearing the Ashcombe crest. He held it toward Patricia. She did not take it at first. "My lord, you will keep this tonight." Lady Harrowby made a small sound of astonishment she could not disguise. Patricia stared at the ring glinting wet in his palm. "I cannot accept such a thing." "You can, and you will. Listen carefully." His voice stayed level. "If you are denied entry, denied food, or prevented from sending lawful correspondence, you place that ring in a sealed note to Bellamy at the Black Gull. No message required. The ring is message enough." The rain seemed louder for one heartbeat, then less. Lady Harrowby found her voice. "This is highly irregular. It is now established." Patricia took the ring because refusal would be folly wrapped as propriety. The gold was cold against her split skin. She closed her fingers around it and felt weight settle there, small and undeniable. Ashcombe gave one final instruction, this time to Reeve and the boy behind him. "You witnessed her arrival and admission. Mark the hour. If she is turned out tonight, you return her to the inn and wake me, whatever the hour." "Yes, my lord," Reeve said. Lady Harrowby stepped back from the doorway at last, all graciousness over steel. "Patricia, you are dripping on the tiles. Go change at once." Patricia moved inside. The coat hung heavy from her shoulders. She stopped just past the threshold and turned because she could not prevent herself. Ashcombe had not mounted yet. He stood in open rain at the edge of the portico light, motionless as carved basalt, watching until she crossed fully into the hall. Only then did he incline his head once, a gesture too slight to name in any social vocabulary she knew. "Sleep if you can, Miss Erickson," he said. "Your hands must be bound and salved before dawn." She wanted to answer with something measured and proper. What came out was bare truth. "You watched the key." "Yes." "Why?" His face didn't change. Rain ran from his jaw in a thin line. "Because men who carry burdens they were never meant to carry should not be left unwitnessed." He turned then, took the reins from his groom, and rode into the rain without another word, while Patricia stood in Lady Harrowby's bright hall, with his ring hidden in her fist and the first dangerous shape of protection tightening around her life. Lady Harrowby waited until hoofbeats faded beyond the gate, then shut the front door with a force that rattled the side glass. Warmth met Patricia's wet face like a slap. Lavender hung in the hall, heavy and sweet enough to turn her stomach. "Remove that coat," Lady Harrowby said. Patricia untied the collar and folded Ashcombe's greatcoat over her arm with care, water running from the hem onto the tiles. One footman stepped forward for it, then halted at a look from his mistress. "Not you," Lady Harrowby said. "She will carry it herself to the back hall. If a drop stains the Persian runner, she will scrub it on her knees." Patricia inclined her head. "Yes, Lady Harrowby." Lady Harrowby's gaze narrowed at Patricia's closed fist. "Open your hand." Patricia opened it. Gold caught candlelight. The signet lay in her palm, heavy, undeniable. For one breath, Lady Harrowby's face emptied of pretence. Then composure returned, tighter at the mouth. How dramatic men become when a child is frightened. "Give it here." "It was given to me," Patricia said. "It belongs to him." "It does. He instructed me to keep it tonight," Silk whispered as Lady Harrowby took one step closer. "Do not test me in my own hall." Patricia met her eyes. "I am obeying the instruction exactly." A long pause stretched between them. Then Lady Harrowby smiled with all her teeth and none of her warmth. "Very well, you will go to your room. No fire, no breakfast at dawn. At 10, Mr. Fenwick's solicitor calls. You will sign what is put before you." Patricia's hunger twisted. Fear followed it. Neither reached her voice. "I will be present at 10. She carried the coat to the back hall, where old Mrs. Davies stood by the warming closet with red hands and a face lined by 40 years of service. Mrs. Davies took the wet wool silently, eyes moving once to Patricia's ring, once to the raw splits across her knuckles. She did not speak in the corridor. She pressed a small packet of goose-fat salve into Patricia's hand as they crossed in opposite directions. The gesture was so quick it could have been an accident. By the time the attic latch fell behind her, the house clock had struck midnight. Patricia lit the candle stub and set the ring on the bedspread beside Bellamy's receipt, smoothing both papers flat to dry. Then she knelt, lifted the loose board, and drew out the biscuit tin. Oiled cloth, her father's codicil, 2 trust receipts, a letter naming executor duties. The old ledger leaves in his hand and hers. She laid them in order and bound her split fingers with the salve and strips torn from her petticoat. Pain flared hot, then dulled. At dawn, she descended with the documents hidden beneath her apron and the ring tied inside the lining of her cuff. In the still room, she found Martha measuring flour by weak light, shoulders bent, eyes swollen from poor sleep. "They have said I stole the silver salt boats," Martha whispered before Patricia spoke. "Lady Harrowby told Mr. Pike she will dismiss me by noon." Patricia felt the floor steady under her, not from comfort, but from decision. "You did not steal them." Martha shook her head near tears. "I have served this house 28 years. Patricia drew a breath. "Then we do not wait for dismissal. We go to quarter sessions." Martha stared at her. "How?" Patricia untied her cuff seam and placed Ashcombe's signet on the flower table between them. "With this." Mr. Bellamy came himself before 7, hat in both hands, rein still on his shoulders. He had received the ring from Bellamy's boy at first light, as arranged, and did not pretend surprise that the signal had been used. Behind him stood Constable Reed, broad and grave, with a notebook under one arm. "Miss Erickson," Bellamy said quietly, Lord Ashcombe waits in his carriage at the lane end. He asked that I bring lawful witness before any removal. Lady Harrowby arrived in the still-room doorway before Patricia could answer. Rose water and fury entering together. You have no authority to enter this house. Constable Reed touched the brim of his hat. Madam, I am here on report of a road incident and a related allegation of stolen household plate, now disputed. Quarter session sits this morning. Statements are required. Lady Harrowby's laugh was brittle. On whose complaint? Patricia lifted her chin. On mine and on Martha Davies's, and on record evidence concerning the Ericsson Trust. The silence that followed was thin as ice. Lady Harrowby turned to strike. Reed caught her wrist before the blow landed and released it at once when she stopped struggling. Madam, he said, voice formal, do not compel me to note assault. At the courthouse, damp wool and old paper scented the corridor. Bench clerks moved in and out with bundles tied in red tape. Patricia sat beside Martha on a hard oak form, hands clasped over the biscuit tin hidden in a plain sack. Across the aisle, Lord Ashcombe stood in the gallery shadow, coat dark, face unreadable. He did not come down to her. He did not need to. His presence held the room at a measurable angle. When called, Patricia stepped into the witness space and gave her name in a clear voice that shook only once, then steadied. She submitted Bellamy's receipt first, time-marked proof of Lady Harrowby's errand in storm conditions. She submitted Constable Reed's mechanical report next. Axle pin fatigue at the inner edge, not reckless driving, with Bellamy and Reeve attesting to her immediate observation. Dawes, pale but upright, confirmed under oath that he had hauled the team to save the carriage from full overturn. The magistrate entered it into record and dismissed the negligence rumour on the spot. Then Patricia opened the biscuit tin. The courtroom quieted as paper met wood, one sheet at a time. Codicil with signatures, trust receipts, dividend entries from the Ericsson shares, household disbursement books in Lady Harrowby's hand with altered figures and diverted sums. Patricia traced the columns with a bandaged finger, naming dates, amounts, and transfer paths in the same measured cadence her father had taught at the dining table. Lady Harrowby interrupted twice, then 3 times, each denial thinner than the last. When the magistrate asked whether she disputed the signatures, she said yes. Patricia produced the old letter naming executor obligations. The magistrate compared strokes in silence. His expression changed by degrees. Mrs. Davies was called. She testified that Lady Harrowby had instructed her to move the silver salt boats to an upstairs escritoire drawer the night before the theft claim was made, then ordered them discovered in Martha's work basket at dawn. Mr. Pike, shaking, confirmed he had found them where told to look. The loaded glances of frightened servants that had followed Patricia for years found language at last. Lady Harrowby surged from her place and reached for Patricia's shoulder. Court officers stepped in from both sides, holding her back with practised restraint. No shouting followed. The room did not need volume. It needed record. Judgment came before noon. The magistrate censured Lady Harrowby for fraud, coercive misrepresentation, and false accusation against a servant. Pending full civil accounting, he removed her household authority, ordered immediate access to trust assets under court supervision, and remanded her to debtor confinement when she failed to post security. The order was read in full. Every word landed clean. Outside, rain had thinned to a cold mist over the churchyard stones. Patricia stood beneath a yew with her mantle clutched tight, teeth striking once, then again. Ashcombe came to her without escort and set his coat around her shoulders before she could refuse. His injured wrist was freshly bound. The old scar showed pale at the edge. "You will not be invisible again," he said. If you consent, stand beside me, not behind me. She touched the scar lightly with 2 fingers, careful of the healing cut. Does it hurt still? His throat moved. He gave no answer. He did not step away. They crossed to the chapel while Reed and Bellamy waited under the porch with Mrs. Davies and Martha, all 4 called as witnesses, because Patricia had asked for witnesses and now expected the world to honour plain terms. At the door, Ashcombe said one word. "Stay." The bells ceased between strikes. Patricia faced him, wet hair at her temples, bandaged hands visible in the grey light. "I will keep my name. Ericsson remains in law beside any title. I will hold control of my father's restored accounts. Wages are to be guaranteed in writing for every retained servant at Ashcombe Hall and at Harrowby during transition, including Mrs. Davies and Martha. No woman in your employ will be dismissed without written cause and severance. If you accept this, I enter." "I accept each term," he said, "in writing. Today." The vicar was summoned. Reed signed. Bellamy signed. Mrs. Davies, with shaking fingers, made her mark. Martha signed her own name in careful block letters Patricia had taught her at the kitchen table after supper scraps. The register closed on wet ink and lawful consent. Before dusk, Ashcombe's solicitor delivered the first instruments to the magistrate clerk. Transfer orders for the Ericsson Trust income, a management appointment naming Patricia Ericsson as controlling signatory, and wage covenants sealed for retained staff. Dawes's statement clearing his name was copied to the posting records. The silver theft allegation against Martha was struck from household books and from constable notes alike. At dawn the next morning, pale light spread across the long table in the Ashcombe Estate office. Ledgers lay open in ordered stacks. Patricia sat with her father's old figures on one side and the new accounts on the other, her bandaged hand guiding a clean column down the page. Ashcombe stood beside her in silence, not at the head, not issuing command, waiting until she looked up before turning the next ledger toward her. She nodded once, and together they began the day.